Welcome back to Pause It For Me, our podcast. Why do we call it Pause It For Me? Because when we're in the middle of a movie and we want to talk about something, we say, hey, pause it for me.
Yeah, so we can discuss little tidbits.
Which is basically what we're doing.
Yeah.
The little tidbit that we're discussing today is the first in our series of chronological film landmarks. We're going through the decades of film history and touching on those big movie moments that we just totally missed out on, starting with Metropolis from 1927, directed by Fritz Lang. This is a German film that is said to be one of the first science fiction movies, which I was very excited to see. So before we jump into it, I'll just read the logline. In a futuristic city sharply divided between the working class and the city planners, the son of the city's mastermind falls in love with a working class prophet who predicts the coming of a savior to mediate their differences. I didn't think that they'd be able to boil it down so nicely to a little one-liner there, because a lot happens in this movie.
Well, it's basically the tagline at the end. You know, the mediator between the head and the hands is the heart. That's
Exactly.
basically what the movie is.
Right. So speaking of that, if this is your first time here, we will be spoiling this movie. So
Yeah.
get ready for that. But it's almost 100 years old. So if you haven't seen it by now, hopefully this podcast will get you interested enough to go watch it.
Well, since this movie is a silent film, I think we should talk silently.
Okay, audience members out there, you're just going to have to read our thoughts on this movie based on our body language alone. Here we go. What are you doing?
I'm pretending to do like a fake whisper
Okay.
into the microphone.
So speaking of it being a silent movie, I'm curious of your thoughts, because the only of the fact that it was a silent movie, because the only silent movie that we had seen before this, at least for me, was Nosferatu, which,
Right.
as we've said before, if you're kind of watching the home experience, it's a little bit boring, it's a little bit weird, but we saw it with a live prog rock band who did the music right in front of you as sort of like a concert, and that made it really engaging and fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
So personally, I found this kind of refreshing to jump into a silent film, and like every once in a while I'd kind of take stock of the apartment and I'd be like, we've been sitting in, like, not in silence, but with no talking, watching this movie for like a good hour or so. It's very interesting. It's almost like putting on an instrumental vinyl record in a way. It felt like a very unique, purposeful experience.
You're like immersed in it.
Yeah. What was your take?
Well, since Nosferatu came out in 1922, and I don't think it has as good as like a film restoration, I don't think people kept as good of copies of it. I think
Right.
Metropolis is like one of the best silent films I've ever seen, because it was right during the transition period between silent film era and talkies.
Mhm.
So it was like kind of at a time where they had perfected the silent films and they were already on their way out.
That makes sense. It was interesting because, you know, we'll get into this in a second, the particular version that we watched. The one that we watched had what I felt was very modern music. I didn't feel like it was music taken from a really old version that came out around the time when it was originally released, or even like a couple decades after. It felt like a score that had been produced in the past few years, like in the 2000s.
So, based on what I skimmed on Wikipedia, it's the same score as the original,
Like
but
sheet music.
sheet music written for the original release, but for the 2010 restoration, they re-recorded it with an orchestra. So that's why
2010, okay.
it sounds new, but it is the original score.
That's exactly what I hoped was the case, because I figured it was new, but I really was pulling for the fact that they would have used the original sheet music from when it originally came out. Like, I wanted it to be new, but not different.
I think that's the problem with Nosferatu. I mean, I haven't looked into it enough, but my feeling was the home release, the orchestra music didn't line up. So maybe they didn't have the original score for that.
Right. For Metropolis, I thought that the music was fantastic.
Yeah, I thought it was really good.
It was very engaging, very fulfilling. Did they say when you were reading Wikipedia who like put the score together for this version? Because at times it sounded Danny Elfman-esque, but you know, maybe that's just me.
Maybe he's just inspired by that because Danny Elfman does a lot of sci-fi score.
Mhm.
So it's possible he's using Metropolis as inspiration.
That makes sense. Metropolis was based on a novel, and the director was Fritz Lang, who would go on to direct M just a few years later. M is a film that I was thinking of putting on our list, but I decided one film that from the director was enough.
Maybe eventually.
Mm-hmm.
So the book was actually written by his wife with the intention of being made into a movie, much like Memento was a book intended to be made into a movie.
Right. Fritz Lang's wife, you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, and he weighed in on the screenplay adaptation and took out some elements of the novel. But that's what it was based on, basically.
Interesting. It might have made a bit more sense as a novel, but I felt it was very interesting watching this because it was a very complex story, I felt. Like simple from like a top layer, but there was a lot going on in the little moments of micro storytelling. So I thought it was interesting that so much of it was just told through body language, and not every line spoken by the actors needed a subtitle, needed a title card to explain what they were saying, because most of what they were saying you could just pick up based on context. And I thought that was really interesting. I think it sheds a bit of light on how more modern movies might be overly written. You know, there's some stuff that you don't really need to come right out and say. You can just pick it up based on body language and context.
I think that's part of the show not tell kind of thing, that some directors are really good at showcasing what a moment means without conveying exactly with words. So as I said, it's at the tail end of the silent era. So it's maybe in some cases, I mean, obviously you kind of have to play it up because you're not speaking out loud. It was definitely played up in some areas, but maybe for somewhat comedic effect, or, you know, like Evil Maria was kind of out there, but it was funny. And I think that's kind of my perspective of Evil Maria was, it's what a robot thinks a human would do.
Okay, yeah,
so
that makes sense.
I gave it a little bit of a pass. It's like the robot thinks that an evil woman would act like this. I don't know.
It was pretty kooky.
But I think overall, the acting for what it was of silent film was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that Freder, the Gustav, I believe, who played Freder, carried the film quite nicely. I thought he nicely played one of those characters who seems kind of like a poop nose, a little bit despicable at the beginning of the movie, but then he quickly changes his attitude and has something worth fighting for, becomes more sympathetic.
I didn't see him as despicable. I just saw him as like a privileged person with like a silver spoon that didn't know any other life. And that's why he traded spots with Georgie, so that he could experience the worker person's life and get like an idea of what it's like to be a worker person, and not like the son of like the head of the city. What I kept on thinking while I was watching it is it reminded me a lot of Moses, like Prince of Egypt, where Freder is like Moses. He's like the son of the head of the city, much like Moses was the Prince of Egypt. And, you know, once he was with his quote unquote people, his brothers, you know, he related to the experience more, and he became the mediator for his people that, you know, was prophesized by Maria, the prophetess.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It kind of makes me want to add the 10 Commandments to our list. True. And the only reason that I didn't add it was because it's so long. I think it's like 4 hours.
I don't even know. I mean, it must be his whole life then. Because,
is this his whole life?
Yeah, because Prince of Egypt, it only goes up to like him being like a young man. And you don't see him like of old age or anything.
Well, maybe we'll get around to that.
I don't know.
Metropolis. So the particular version of Metropolis that we watched was around 2.5 hours. A bit long, especially for a silent film.
That was part of the initial criticism, which is why the original premiere was 158 minutes. And the version we watched, I think, was like 148 minutes, like mostly restored.
Right, okay.
With the old cuts. But the version that was readily available in the 1920s that most cinema goers would have seen was like 117 or something like that. So it would have been a lot more digestible. I think you can tell which shots that they brought back in that hadn't been used in a long time because they were lower quality from like an older print that wasn't the same aspect ratio. So you could tell like what they were cutting out, and they were mostly just cutting the fat. It was just
Yeah,
like
well,
extra reaction shots, things going on with side characters that isn't as important to the story. And yeah, so I could see how you could watch it without, but I feel like it gives more context to see it the whole way, or like almost all. I don't know what would have been missing out of what we had seen, but
a little bit. They had text on screen.
oh, that's true.
So
On the one
certainly
area.
for film history purposes, I can see why they put those scenes back in, not necessarily to fulfill better pacing or a better story, but just for better context. So I'll jump right into some trivia here. So my first piece of trivia is extremely short, and then my second piece of trivia is maybe the longest piece of trivia I've ever seen on on an IMDb entry.
Okay.
But it has to do with the version that we watched. So,
Right.
first piece of trivia. The film takes place in 2026. We're only just a few years away from that.
You know, it's funny. On the Wikipedia page, it actually said that there's debate about what year it was supposed to be. In the original cut of the film, it didn't specify what
Mhm.
year it was. And then in subsequent releases, they added the cue cards that said what year it was supposed to be, like 2026. In one release, it was the year 3000. So I think it's just whatever the people felt like putting in for
Yeah,
distribution.
fair enough. And of course,
Yeah.
all over IMDb is like trivia put on by people who don't know anything and are just writing random crap. So it doesn't really matter what year it
Yeah.
takes place because it's kind of like it's a little bit like Batman the Animated Series, where it's timeless in a way because it feels old and modern at the same time.
Yeah, it's the sort of futuristic modern, like when you think of like something like 2001 Space Odyssey or like THX or any of those older sci-fi movies like Logan's Run.
Mm-hmm.
It's all like what that era thinks the future would be like.
Yeah.
So Metropolis is very Art Deco, which is
Yeah.
very 1920s. And like they're inspired by like metropolitan areas such as New York, the skyscrapers of that era. So they're like, this is what we think the future would look like from the perspective of what's modern in 1920.
Totally. So, for our audience members out there, this next piece of trivia should clear up the situation on the different versions and what exactly we watched. I'm going to try and make it through this without messing up, but like I said, it's a really long piece of trivia. Here we
Mhm.
go. For decades, all that survived of Metropolis were an incomplete original negative and copies of shortened, re-edited foreign release prints. Over a quarter of the film was believed lost. However, in July 2008, Germany's Zeit magazine reported the discovery of a 16mm dupe negative copy of the film at the Buenos Aires Museo del Cine Pablo Ducros Hicken. Did my best on that one. By
That's
film
pretty good.
historian and collector Fernando Martin Peña. Up until then, all that was known was that an original full-length 35mm export print had been sent to Argentina in 1928. The last officially documented screening of this version had occurred in the 1950s and was considered lost. However, since 35mm film was more hazardous to keep in those days, the nitrite inside the negative could sometimes ignite, preservers would often make a 16mm negative copy of the original film that was easier to store.
Oh.
What prompted the discovery was that Martin Peña remembered stories from Argentinian movie operators claiming to have screened a version of Metropolis of over 2 hours long in the 1980s. The only known versions at the time were all considerably shorter. This version had probably been part of a private collection that was later donated to the museum. After finally getting permission to search the museum archives, Martin Peña found the surviving 16mm copy. Examining the reels in Buenos Aires, cinema experts realized that the copy had a relatively poor picture quality, mainly because it had been also copied all the damage from the original 35mm film that had been worn from years of use.
Oh, okay.
The copying process from 35mm to 16mm film also meant that some parts of the frame had been lost. Nevertheless, the reels contained almost all of the previously missing sequences, around 25 minutes worth of footage, predominantly those involving the Thin Man who spies on Freder and Worker 11811 heading to and from Yoshiwara. Additionally, in October 2008, it was announced that another, hopefully early copy in the obsolete 9.5mm format had been held in the University of Chile's film library, intentionally mislabeled to avoid destruction during 1973's military coup. Very
Wow.
interesting. It is as yet unknown if this holds any further viewable footage. The missing scenes from the 2008 16mm copy were cleaned up as best as possible, reframed into the 4:3 aspect ratio to match the original footage, and re-edited into the film based on the original screenplay. Almost 80 years later, the film is now practically complete, barring sections such as Freder listening to a priest giving a sermon on the coming apocalypse and Joe Frederson's fight with Rotwang. And that's the version that we watched on the Criterion app
Mhm.
on our
So,
Chromecast.
so it's the most purest version that we could have watched, basically.
Yeah. So I understand why they cut it down. Some
Yeah.
scenes, like, like you said, trim the fat. Some of the fat could have been trimmed, but I'm glad that we were able to watch such a pure original experience.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's sort of like the director's cut. So it's good to have an idea of what the original vision for the movie was, at least. I think the footage that wasn't the old restored 2008 footage looked really good still from 1927 because they had the good transfer.
Mhm.
Whereas the other copy, the 16mm that was really worn out, it's what you would think of when you think of a silent movie, like kind of crappy quality, and it's because it didn't age well on
Yeah.
the film print.
But they say
Yeah.
sound is half of video. So the fact that the audio quality was so crystal clear because they had recorded the soundtrack more recently
That's part of it.
helped me get a lot more invested in the story.
So yeah, I can get behind silent films a lot more if they're in really good quality and have good audio.
Yeah. So I thought the story was just complex enough that I had questions and I was kept guessing, but not so complex that I got totally lost. Somewhere around the middle, around the time when Evil Maria, if that's what we're calling her, was
That's basically it.
dancing, I started to kind of lose it a little bit.
That was so funny though. It was like an idea of what a robot thinks is sexy is what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
But like not only that, but like the reason why that was happening, I felt didn't have much to do with the plot. But after that, I kind of was looped back on board again. I thought, the point A to point B made enough sense. I was able to follow it decently, except for the only things that I was confused about were what Rotwang's motivations were. So I understood that, Freder, he has this experience where he has this vision where he sees this giant machine as basically leading all these workers to their death. And he's like, I want better rights, better living situation for those in the lower class. Literally lower class is there's a very intentional,
They're underwater, underground.
and literal
Yeah.
upper and lower class, which I thought was interesting.
It's true.
He has this vision. He's like, I want to follow this woman. I want to lead this cause. I want to do it in a peaceful way. And his father is like, I don't care about the lower class. I just want to be able to live my awesome life. And I'm gonna let them rebel so that I can treat them in even more poor ways, so I have a good excuse.
Yeah.
All that made enough sense. Rotwang, which by the way, interesting name, Rotwang. Maybe it's pronounced in a different way in German, but
Well, yeah, it's a German name, and it was back in the day. It's hard to know what's appropriate for that era.
I love that character though. I thought he had a really cool look.
It was interesting.
I thought he had that classic mad scientist lab setting, which is really cool.
Like Frankenstein-esque.
Yeah, exactly. And it reminded me almost of like Doc Brown's laboratory, not in the Back to the Future movies, but in the Back to the Future game. When it goes back to Doc Brown when he's younger. It reminded me of the electricity and all that going in his laboratory.
Sense.
So I didn't really understand what Rotwang's motivation was. And the woman that he initially made the machine man out of, Hell or Hill, however you want to pronounce it.
I think it's like short for Helena, maybe. I don't know.
Right. So that was Freder's mother.
Yes, that he was in love with, Rotwang.
Okay. See, that wasn't explicitly said, so I wasn't sure if he was in love with her or if that was his daughter, because Rotwang seemed to be a pretty decent, a decent amount older than Joe Fredersen.
My impression was that he had like loved her from like afar, like unrequited or something, because he had her tombstone, which I think the idea of that was to convey that he was trying to make a robot in her likeness. So
Yeah.
maybe he like digged up a grave or something and like copied her. I don't know. That's a guess.
Right. So he obviously wanted to have her back. I understood that
Yeah.
motivation. But how that played into him ruining Joe Fredersen's plans, or Joel Fredersen, I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. I didn't really understand how that fit in. He agrees to make the Machine Man look like Maria, and I'm not entirely sure why. So all that I was pretty murky on. I don't know if you have another take on that.
Well, there was like a twist because it was revealed later in like the scene that was cut out that Yo was listening to them talking in the attic, Rotwang and Maria, and he was like, little does he know that, you know, I'm gonna use Maria for my plans and not his. I don't know.
But did that really come back? He didn't really end up doing it.
No, I think at the end he was like, I want to turn her back to hell. And so then he like chases Maria to like turn her back to hell, Helena, maybe. I don't know.
Right. So if I had to criticize the plot, that part didn't really make sense. But in terms of the rest of it, I was pretty impressed that there were like once in a while a scene would happen and I wouldn't understand what was going on. Like Joe Fredersen, or Yo, I'm just gonna say Joe. Sorry if I'm getting that wrong. Was saying, you know, if they want to rebel, let them rebel. You know, let them have their way tonight. Talking about the lower class, and I would think, oh, that's weird. I don't understand. Like, why is he? Is it because he? And then the very next scene, Rotwang was like, oh, Fredersen wants to let them rebel so that, you know, they'll take harsh measures, which will give him excuse to use harsh measures against them. And I'm like,
Right.
oh, good. I'm glad that
makes sense.
You know, they explained it, so I wasn't confused.
Mm-hmm.
Good sense of storytelling, I found.
Yeah, so my take with you were saying that you didn't understand what evil Maria was doing in the beginning. My take with the dancing and all that kind of stuff in the beginning was they were trying to discredit the original Maria that was seen as like a prophetess, someone that was really wholesome and good. So then they showed her like literally having the 7 deadly sins wrapped around her, and she had the headpiece. The evil Maria had the headpiece that looked like the evil woman in the painting. I think it was called The Whore of Babylon that she was recreating. So it was showing like, oh, Maria is not this wholesome goody. She's actually bad and like is making men turn against each other and like creating chaos. So like she should be discredited, I think. Something like that.
That makes enough sense. But what do you think Rotwang's like end goal was? Like, because he obviously was folded into the main plot. I didn't really.
They cut out in the 35 millimeter print. They cut out a lot of his side story stuff, and it was mostly in the not so good footage. I think my take was that he wanted to be revolutionary. He wanted like the first robot woman machine man to be created. Like he wanted to make history maybe. And you know, he thought maybe if the Yo Fredersen got involved with it, it would maybe like finance his project or something. So he can recreate hell. I don't know. It's a guess.
I appreciate the guess, but it is a bit of a reach.
I don't think we were supposed to really dwell on that too much. I think it was supposed to be more about Freder and his love story with Maria and like, you know, bringing the city together, stuff like that.
Yeah. What impressed me about this movie was, especially considering how early it was in the landscape of cinema, how big of a story they were trying to tell. You know, it had these big set pieces and these hundreds of actors, and they were trying to tell what felt like a really large and in charge story.
Yeah, that's because it was right on the cusp of the end of the silent era. So we were seeing a lot of bigger, longer feature-length films being made before silent films were a lot shorter. But I think as cinema became more popular, more money was devoted to making longer films, and it was easier because they knew how to do it more. Like Nosferatu, I think, is like an hour. And it was only a couple years before.
Right. I mean, so by the time I think what made it for me worth it was the escape scene from the lower areas when they're flooding. Because up until that
Yeah.
point, I was thinking, this movie is it's pretty slow, but I guess it's entertaining so far. But by the time we got to that escape scene, I was feeling pretty gripped in that it really had me wondering what was going to happen. Like I didn't know if the kids were going to escape because
Yeah.
we didn't have modern film conventions where like, if this film came out in the 2020s, it's like, okay, yeah, obviously the kids are going to escape. They're not just going to kill hundreds of kids. But back in 1927, I was like, oh, you never
They
know. Maybe
might.
they are going to kill hundreds of kids.
Yeah.
And with all the buildings crumbling apart and the flood rising, and then Freder has to climb up like the scaffolding to get to the top and then rip the bars out of the wall. I was like, oh, this is starting to get really exciting.
Yeah.
I'm really gripped by it. And by that point, I was pretty locked in to the point where,
It was There's
all,
only a few minutes left of the film.
well, but that was okay because
Yeah.
I was like, all we need is an ending that kind of ties us up pretty nicely, and I'll
Mhm.
give this movie a thumbs up. And I felt that it had that, and so I came out of it thinking that it was actually pretty great.
I think there was a lot to love about it. In the terms of the quality of filmmaking of that era, I think they did some interesting shots. Like I really liked how they had sort of the different eyes and they had like pictures in the frame.
Yeah, yeah.
So like, there'd be like 10 eyes. I thought that was really creative from that era. I guess they would have literally copy and pasted it on each other.
Well, apparently that was like not done through editing. That was like an on the day effect. They
Whoa.
either did it in camera, like I read a couple of pieces of trivia which kind of said that different shots like that were done different ways. They either did it in camera using mirrors with strategic parts of the mirrors
Ooh,
scratched out,
that's cool.
or they did like double or triple or quadruple exposures where they ran the film through the camera again and exposed different parts of the
That's
frame.
neat. So
Crazy.
I appreciate all the creative stuff they did. Like there's a shot where Freder is like picking up something like a cloth.
Yep.
And they use like a POV shot where it's like his arm picking it up. And I was like, woo, I wouldn't expect something from a film this old. So I appreciated like the creativity and pushing the boundaries of that current medium. I thought that was cool. And I thought Evil Maria was funny. Like that created the biggest laughs for me. Like, oh, it's Maria the robot. We're seeing her for the first time. And she does like this weird wink in like a close up. And I was like cackling. I was like, this is supposed to be like menacing.
Yeah. Part of the reason why I didn't choose a film earlier than this to start our sort of chronological lesson in movie histories was because I thought it might be a little too boring.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be as engaging. This feels the most like a more modern movie. Like it has like a full narrative structure, effects, costuming,
tension,
lots of
great
actors.
music.
Yeah.
So the question that I really wanted to ask and answer as part of this podcast was, we're just about 100 years out from the release of this movie. In a couple of years, it'll be 100 years since this came out. Is it still worth watching 100 years later?
It is from the perspective of history. Like I think it is an easy pill to swallow in terms of other silent films not holding up as well, because they were experimenting with the craft so much back then that, even like a train moving towards the camera seemed cool because it hadn't been done before. But up to that point, cinema had been around like 20, 30 years by the time that Metropolis was made. So they're already able to figure a lot of things out. And I think it's a really great representation of black and white cinema, silent cinema. And, I think obviously it showcases what's to come in the future. A lot of people have taken inspiration from the Art Deco style, like, maybe 2001 Space Odyssey, sort of like the Art Deco modern style at the very end of 2001. You know, the robot is very similar to C3PO. George Lucas said that was
For
his
sure. Yeah.
inspiration.
That was like, as a Star Wars fan, that was kind of the main reason why I wanted to watch this, but only because I didn't really have many expectations going in.
That's all I knew was the robot. I've seen
Yeah.
the iconic shot of the robot with like the spherical
Yeah.
lights going up and down it, and I was like, that's what this movie's about, right? Like a robot. And it was like
Kind of.
partially.
Yeah.
And most of the time she looks like a human, so
It's the iconography of it, I guess.
oh
You
yeah,
know, like you
for
can't
sure.
exactly show the heart machine. Not everyone's going to be able to pick that out of a lineup of
Yeah.
different machines, but you know, that robot, I don't even know if it's like really a gold robot, because you know, you see the poster on IMDb and it's gold, but maybe they're just pulling the gold from C3PO because it's a
I
black and white movie.
I
Who's to
think
say
I
what
read
color it was?
something that it was made of plastic wood. I don't remember what the color was.
Plastic
That's what
wood?
it said. I don't know. So,
Okay.
I mean, it has to be some kind of material that's movable. I would imagine it's kind of like what superhero costumes are made of now, that it looks really heavy, but it's actually light to
Well,
move around in.
apparently the actress had a really terrible time inside of that suit.
I don't doubt it.
And like, because Anthony Daniels in the C3PO suit also had a pretty bad time
Yeah.
with it. I think, you know, the leg on the first day like shattered and like cut up his
Yeah.
you know, calf or whatever. And that was like 60 years later.
Yeah. in
So
the
just imagine
70s.
that effects work 60 years
Yeah.
earlier. Apparently she was just getting like bruised and cut up inside of there, and it's terrible.
There was less regulations for cinema and like what actors can and can't do. Now today it's much more regulated, but in the 20s it was kind of like, we're going to treat you a little bit like slaves and you're just going to do everything we ask.
Yeah. Reading some of the trivia, that's very apparent that the director Fritz Lang did not care much for the comfort and rights of some of the actors.
Like in the flooding scene, I think he purposely kept the water on the cooler side to make the actors, like to make it feel realistic to the actors that it was cold water rushing around them. And it's like, they're actors. They can pretend that it's colder than it is. You don't have to like keep them in cold water.
I could see doing that to a certain point.
If they're okay with it.
As long as they don't get like hypothermia, I mean.
If they're a method actor, maybe. But not all actors want to do that.
500 extras of
and their
kids.
children.
Yeah.
They could get colds or something. I don't know.
Either way, I felt like that was the best scene in the movie.
Oh yeah, because it was the most dramatic. All the tiny little children rushing out. Maria's trying to trigger the alarm, and all the kids are rushing up onto her. It was very cinematic.
It was tense.
Yeah.
Good sense of tension.
It was like, oh, what are they going to do? The water's rising. How are they going to get out of this?
Yeah, we're playing Forbidden Island and somebody played a Waters Rise card.
Yeah.
Basically. So speaking of that big scene, so another piece of trivia here. Adjusting for inflation in June 2007, the budget for Metropolis was 5 million Reichsmarks?
I guess that's
Reichsmarks?
That's green.
German.
Green.
So,
yeah.
It's green.
German money.
Those greenbacks.
Yeah.
Which is equivalent to $200 million. So big movie. And it showed.
Yeah.
And I felt like it was very effective because certainly many of those city crumbling shots with the water rushing through had to be miniatures.
Yeah, it was miniatures.
But it really didn't occur to me that they were miniatures until most of the way through the scene. And then there was one shot in particular where I was like, oh, just the way the water's falling, this kind of looks like a miniature. But the rest of it, I totally bought. Like, I wasn't thinking like these are actors on a sound stage with whatever. I was like, these are these characters in this situation and their whole world is crumbling.
I mean, considering the era, it was probably pretty cutting edge if it was 200 million. That's like today with Avatar Way of Water. I think they spent like $1 billion on it. It's like, this is the most cutting edge you can make cinema at the time in 1927.
Well, I don't think we'll be adding Avatar 2 to the end of our list. So I might make the list public. Right now it ends in the 90s, right around Schindler's List.
I feel like we've seen a lot of movies from like the 90s, 2000s, 2010s.
80s especially. Like the 80s is very underrepresented on the list, but it's because we've seen so many
Yeah.
80s movies
So
already.
we don't need to fill in the gaps so much for more modern cinema, whereas the older cinema is,
It's our main
the
focus.
20th century of Hollywood is more what we need to fill in the gaps of.
Yeah. I don't know what movies from the 2010s or even 2020s are worth adding to a list of like culturally significant films. Like I don't like Tenet,
The
maybe. Like
the Grand Budapest Hotel.
well, we've seen
Yeah.
that.
No, I'm saying just in terms of movies that I think will be timeless.
Right.
It's hard to say.
Well, it's because like so the only ones that I would be able to think of are like Best Picture winners.
Yeah.
But as we know, Best Picture winners don't always go on to continue to be culturally
like
relevant.
in 10 years.
Like The Artist. Like who's remembering The Artist? Who's still watching The Artist?
Yeah, I don't know.
Nobody cares about The Artist. It won Best Picture, but like great.
Usually the movies that end up winning, not every year, but a lot of years, is the most mediocre movie of the 10 nominations. Because it's not divisive. Yeah, it's either like some people on the Academy really like the one entry, some people really like the other entry, and then like the third option, the one in between, ends up winning because it's generally the most palpable.
Exactly. So final piece of trivia for Metropolis here before we wrap up. The connection of this film to the Nazi regime is quite remarkable.
That makes sense.
Thea von Harbo, geez, I gotta get better at pronouncing some of these names, who was Fritz Lang's wife, was an ardent and early supporter of the party. Not only Adolf Hitler, but all the inner circle were entranced by the film and considered it as a sort of social blueprint. I don't think they watched the movie with the right attitude, if that's what they got out of it. Of course, they're Nazis, but come on.
I mean,
smarten up.
The original intent, quote unquote, of the Nazi party and how he got elected was he was saying that it's all about prosperity for the worker, socialism, communism, kind of like equality for man. That was kind of the platform he ran on, and the swastika was like a symbol of prosperity.
Well, good luck with that.
It obviously got contorted, and he obviously did a lot of terrible things with it, but I think maybe his initial idea was like workers' rights, and then it's like kind of just veered off.
Right, but if you're going to watch a sci-fi movie and be like, this is what I want my world to be, it's like, put some more thought into that.
Yeah.
So finishing off, Fritz Lang, of course, was Jewish, but the Fuhrer offered him a pass for his ingenuity and vision, apparently saying, we decide who's Jewish. Very rare in Nazi Germany. Fritz Lang fled to Paris and then eventually America. Ridiculous.
Oh, you're Jewish and I hate all Jewish people, but because you made a cool movie, I'm not going to kill you. What? What a terrible man.
So overall, I thought this was actually pretty good. It was better than I thought it was going to be. If it wasn't for like the big set piece of the flood, I think I might have been a little more bored. But for the most part, I felt like it had a strong story. I'd be interested to maybe read the novel if it has good reviews. And I think apart from its historical value, judging the movie on its own as a movie, I think it is worth watching 100 years later.
I think it's worth watching, but is it going to be like the greatest movie of all time?
Absolutely.
I don't think
no.
I don't think so, but we have like 100 years of cinema to compare it to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been inspired by, Lang's work back then. So it's hard to put it up to that,
I mean, it's no Toy Story, but
obviously
things can be.
I think, there's some relatable elements to it, like Frere's Woody. I don't know. I think it's worth watching, but is it the greatest movie? No.
Oh, certainly not.
No.
But that's okay. Not every movie has to be the greatest movie.
It's hard to rate it on like a modern scale. Like a modern movie that I would give a 10 out of 10. I think it's unfair to compare it to those even because it's like 100 years removed. Of course, it's not going to be as good as modern movies, So it's hard to give it a good rating.
There was still quality filmmaking I found.
Yeah.
Like the shots were nice. The
Absolutely.
acting was nice. Can't really comment on the editing because of the particular
There's
situation.
a lot of jump cuts,
you
but
know?
I think that was more prevalent back then.
I consider usually I consider a good movie, a well-written movie, one that has a decent amount of plant and payoff, because it shows that they were really thinking about their point A to point B. And I found a small aspect of that, like early in the movie, like one of the first scenes when the workers are marching in, they're going to work, they have all their heads hung down
Yeah.
all together in
They're
a certain
going down
way.
in the elevator. I thought
And
that was cool.
and I was thinking, like, why do they all have their heads hung like that? That's very interesting. I want to know why. Then way later in the movie, when they're in that cathedral-esque place in the basement, they have their heads hung in the same way. And I'm like, oh, they're probably all praying. They're
Right.
probably all thinking about that whole plan and their future. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably just really distraught and they're like, how are we going to get out of this? We're stuck in this life.
Well, I'm saying, like, visually, what I found was in the cathedral scene, they had their heads hung down in the exact same way. And in that context, it was more clear that they were praying, like before. I think it was just before Maria started speaking.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right. So I would give this film a solid 8. And not just because of its historical context, but just I was entertained enough to make it through the movie. Around the intermezzo part, which I thought was intermission, but it didn't seem like much of an intermission.
But then it said end of and then something else. So I don't know.
Around that point,
it's like end of part 1, maybe.
I was starting to get a little bit sleepy, but then it picked up after that and it ended pretty well. So I would give this a solid 8.
It's so hard though, because it's a film that has been restored in some elements, so we're not seeing it like the full way we would have seen it as like the German premiere. So it's hard to say. I'm trying to put myself in the mind of someone that would have lived during that era. And I think during that era, I probably would have given it a very high score. Because it would have been probably the coolest movie I had seen up to that point.
Yeah. So rating?
No. I think I'm going to give it a 7. Because
fair enough.
I think it was good, but there were still parts as I was watching it that I feel like I blacked out for a few seconds where I'm like, huh, what's going on? Oh, okay, they're just running away or something.
Yeah, but that happens in good movies too.
Yeah.
Once in a while.
I think it's harder for me to watch something that doesn't have consistent subtitling. Because when I'm watching something with subtitles, I have to pay attention by reading the screen.
Okay.
Whereas it's easy for me to just kind of glaze over for a few seconds when I'm just like staring at nothing with no dialogue.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, lucky for you, I think we only have one more silent film before we make it to the talkies. The next one that we're going to be watching is The Passion of Joan of Arc.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think just came out the next year or maybe 2 years after Metropolis.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see how it holds up to that, because Metropolis is a high budget movie and I don't know if The Passion of the Joan of Arc is the same budget or not. So it'll be interesting to compare movies of that similar era.
Yes, The Passion of the Joan of the Arc.
Yeah, I know I said that weird. Whatever.
Jumpin' Josephat. What's that? Do you see that? The elephant in the room?
There's an elephant in the room?
Yeah, that's wearing a t-shirt that says, Andrew turned off Hannah's mic by accident in the past 2 episodes of Pause It For Me.
Oh, no.
Sorry about that. That was totally my bad because I was recording voiceover for something else and I turned down the dial on the mixer for Hannah's mic because I didn't want any of the sound to bleed over. And I was a doofus during the last 2 episodes and didn't throw in a pair of headphones to check our levels. I just checked them visually. And so I'm sorry, Hannah.
I think he's just covering up because he doesn't want to tell you the real reason that he wants to be the star of the podcast.
Oh, if I wanted to be the star of the podcast, I'd just grab your mic and talk into both mics at the same time like I'm doing right now. But I love you, Hannah, and I want you to have as big of a voice as I do in this endeavor. All right. Well, that pretty much wraps up our thoughts on Metropolis. I'm really glad that we started off our film history chronology with a bang, because I honestly thought that this was going to be a little too boring, and I was nervous that it was going to start off this section of the podcast with a bit of a whimper.
I think we had to talk about it though, because it's one of the most famous silent films and it's an inspiration for sci-fi. So I feel like we had to watch it even if it was bad.
Mm-hmm. So I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, pretty good.
And so look forward to our next episode where we'll be talking about the Passion of Joan of Arc.
Of the Joan of Arc.
The Passion of the Joan of the Arc.
I look forward to it.
All right. See y'all then.
See ya.